And of course, as it gradually makes its way into white singing, lost a lot of that. But at the time, the slaves would know what these songs meant, even if the masters didn't. Another style of music that developed largely in the 19th century was the gospel song. Sometimes people will make a distinction between songs and hymns in that songs have a chorus or a refrain. The gospel songs were often connected with the revivalism of the 19th century and grew out of many of those movements. The gospel songs were often developed to try and respond to the liberalism of the 19th century, but they also ended up shaping Christianity at the time as well. Songs, of course, were simplified presentations of Christian theology, and the concern of songwriters wasn't always doctrinal precision, but what sounded good expressed the feelings of the lyricists. Many of the songs were placed in the first person and expressed emotional connections to God, which would allow anybody who sang it to make that same kind of connection. But the gospel song also gave an opportunity for women to have a public voice, since many of those hymns were written by women, including perhaps the most prolific of the songwriters, a woman named Fanny J. Crosby. She would claim to have written 8,000 songs in her life. But many of those songs were written under pseudonyms, and there are at least 200 different names Fanny J. Crosby used to write songs, according to scholars. Now, publishers were concerned that their readership, the people that bought the hymn books, would see how much this woman was doing and not buy the hymn book or be concerned about what they were doing, and so they encouraged her and others to adopt these fake names. But of course, Crosby still, even though her name might not be attached to some of the hymns that she wrote, was still a very prolific writer and written some songs that are still very popular. Things like Blessed Assurance, To God Be the Glory, and Jesus Keep Me Near the Cross are all, that's just three of the 8,000 hymns that she supposedly wrote. What questions do you have about music in the 19th century? Not only was Christianity experiencing revival during this time, and there were new forms of music being developed, well, there were other people in the 19th century that were developing some new forms of Christianity. Now, in the groups that I'm talking about, it's difficult from our perspective to think of them as Christianity. But as these movements were developing, the founders and the early adherents saw themselves as part of Christianity. And so theologically we might say, well, that might not be considered Christians. But I'm including them here because they often saw what they were doing as being a Christian endeavor. Many Christians that lived at the same time as these were developing, however, did not see them as Christianity, saw them as a perverted form of Christianity, because many of them often were included some sort of idea of new revelation, or developed ideas that were contrary to a lot of the teaching at the time. Most of these movements we're talking about developed in the United States, but some did develop in England, and there were other movements developing in places like Africa and Asia as missionaries introduced or reintroduced Christianity there. We don't have time to look at all of them. Instead, I want to mention we'll talk about three. One rather minor one, and then two more successful ones. The minor one is the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing, which developed in England in the late 18th century, but eventually moved to the United States, where it does have some success. There are 8 followers that come along with Anne Lee Stanley, also known as Mother Anne Lee, She had become a member of a group known as the Shaking Quakers, because during their services they would tremble, run around their meeting halls, shout, and leap for joy. But eventually she would break off and start her own movement. Mother Ann preached that God was both male and female. She also claimed that sexual activity was the root of all sin, and so to become a member of the United Society of Believers, you had to give up any sort of sexual activity, even if you were already married. So any sort of sexual activity, even within the bounds of marriage, was connected to sin. But she also claimed that she had visions and trances, which led her followers to believe she was a female incarnation of Christ. She preached that God was both male and female, that Christ had come as a male, but then would later come as a female, never claiming herself that she was Christ in the flesh, but some of her followers believed that, and eventually that was kind of downplayed. After her death, the movement continued based on the belief that a new order, a new age, was soon to come. Right? Christ's second appearing was soon going to take place. Thus, you don't need sexual activity to continue to propagate the human race. The new age was coming. The movement grew in the early 19th century, starting first in New York and New England, moving to Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky. By the middle of the century, there were around 6,000 members. They were more popularly known as the Shakers because of their line dance, where the men would be on one side of the room, the women would be on the other side of the room in lines, and they would shake off their sins in this dance. And so they were known by others as Shakers. When you joined the Shakers, any marriage that you were involved in ended, and parents were excluded from their children's lives as people were grouped into different families or orders based on gender and age. You may say, okay, if you join a religious group, one of the ways to continue that religious group is to have children that you indoctrinate or socialize into that religious group. So how do you do that when you don't practice sex? Well, other children came into the movement through children that were adopted by the church or founded or found. People abandoned them. Sometimes in places parents couldn't care for their children and so would give them to the Shakers. And we're talking about the Second Great Awakening, and some children converted to some of these different movements, including the Shakers. The Shakers were very industrious. Even today, Shaker furniture is prized by some people for its simplicity of lines and other things, but they developed a certain style of furniture. They also developed capsule pills. Right? So anytime you take a pill now, right? When you eat your breakfast cereal, think about the Seventh-day Adventists. When you take a pill, think about the Shakers. Or spices. Packaged spices were also invented by the Shakers, as well as a horse-powered washing machine. There is one living Shaker community left in Sabbath Day Lake, Maine. It has 3 members, all of whom are over 60. All right, so the likelihood that this group is going to continue much longer, I have a feeling in the next couple of years I'm going to have to change that part of my note, but every year, they're still there. It's still those 3. Yeah, so it's obviously today not a group that makes too much of an impact. It's still persisted as people have entered for one reason or the other. Questions about the Shakers? On a different trajectory is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, often simply known as Mormonism. It too started small, but today is a thriving group numbering in the millions, 14 to 15 million, with about half in the United States and half throughout the world, mostly in the global South, the so-called Third World. It develops around the same time as in the same cultural situation as the Campbell Restoration movement. And often there were a lot of similar doctrines, but in some important ways there's quite a bit of difference. The founder of Mormonism was a man named Joseph Smith. Born in 1805 in Vermont, eventually moves to upstate New York. His family was very religious, but evidently never associated with any one particular Christian denomination. They were involved in folk magic, like a lot of people were at the time. Astrology, other types of things that people turned to for information, other types of things. According to the church tradition, at the age of 15, Joseph is, his religious sensibilities are developed, and his family has been moving between all these different denominations, and he's perplexed by all this confusion, and he wants to know which is the true church, which is the one that he should be joining. And so he goes out into this grove of trees near his family home, deciding he's going to pray for wisdom, according to James 1:5, and wait for God to tell him what church he should join. And while he's praying, again according to the church's tradition, two persons appear to him in a pillar of light, identifying themselves as the Father and the Son. And they tell Smith that all the churches are wrong. Their creeds, their statements of beliefs are abominations, their leaders are corrupt, and so he isn't to join any of them. But instead, he's going to restore the Church of Jesus Christ. God's going to work through him to restore the Church of Jesus Christ. This event is referred to as the first vision, right? Capital F, capital V. Very important time in Mormon history. About 3 years later, Joseph is visited by an angel who identifies himself as Moroni. And Moroni tells Joseph that there is a book written on golden plates that has been deposited in a nearby hill that tells of the former inhabitants of the North American continent, that he is to retrieve the plates and then to translate. Once the plates are translated, supposedly, they form the basis of what's known as the Book of Mormon. Essentially, the Book of Mormon told the tale of a Jewish family living around the time of the destruction of Solomon's Temple, right, so the 6th century BC, who is warned to flee from the coming destruction of the Babylonians, and they eventually end up in what is today North America. Now, this is a very simplified version of the narrative. This family grows and prospers, eventually into two tribes that would sometimes battle each other. After Jesus' ministry in the 1st century, and before his ascension, so after his resurrection, before he fully ascends, he appears to these tribes and shares his message with them, supposedly the same message he had given the Jews. Eventually, this message and the story of these early inhabitants of North America were written down by a man named Mormon, hence the Book of Mormon, and it is deposited in a hill in what will be upstate New York that will sit for several centuries before it is dug up. There are other stories in the Book of Mormon and other scriptures and revelations that are given to Joseph that talk about all sorts of things that make Mormonism distinctive. And things like the Garden of Eden existing on the American continent. And in the spot, believed perhaps to be in Missouri, the New Jerusalem would be established. Actually, it was... No, it wasn't Branson. I want to say Jackson City, but yeah, it wasn't Branson. Other things include the idea that God was a physical being, that he was not totally spiritual, but had been a physical life. Other distinctive practices included baptism for the dead, not the baptizing of dead people, but individuals who would, on the behalf of a dead person, be baptized, right? So if you thought you had a family member who hadn't received the gospel or the opportunity to be baptized, you could be baptized for them in their name. Obviously, as you might expect, Smith and the growing group of individuals who believed in this form of teaching faced a lot of persecution, and so they moved about to various places, eventually settling in Illinois, where Smith and his brother are arrested and eventually assassinated. The group splits after Joseph Smith's death. There is a smaller group known as the Community of Christ. They used to be known as the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but in 2001 they changed their name to Community of Christ. There is a Community of Christ church building on Bell Road, just down the way. That doesn't say to you Mormon, right, when you see Community of Christ. But if you look up on their website, they still believe in the Book of Mormon. They still believe Joseph Smith as a prophet. Leadership of the church passes through Joseph Smith's family. The larger group, however, the one that we know of as Mormons or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, eventually heads west under the leadership of Brigham Young, who had become a convert to Mormonism in 1832, had become a very successful missionary, had risen through the church leadership, and eventually led the Mormons, the Saints as they call themselves, to modern-day Utah in 1847, where he became president of the church. And it was also under Brigham Young's leadership that he revealed that, yes, the church was practicing plural marriage, what commonly is referred to as polygamy. Apparently, Joseph Smith had received a revelation in the 1830s that plural marriage should be practiced by the saints, particularly Joseph and other church leaders. And this, of course, became but it was not publicly, they didn't publicly announce they were actually doing this until 1852, when Young admitted to it, even though people had already suspected. Most Mormon men were monogamous, and probably no more than 10 to 15,000 Mormons lived in polygamous families. But it became a distinctive doctrine, a distinctive practice of the church. It was also important that, the higher you were in the Mormon priesthood, you were almost always married to more than one wife. Those who were both wealthy and high in the priesthood almost had to marry more than one wife, not only for reasons of doctrine, but also peer pressure. Most of the men that were polygamous had 2 or 3 wives at most. But people higher in the church hierarchy had higher numbers of wives. It's estimated that Joseph Smith himself probably had 33 women sealed to him as wives, some of whom, at the time they were sealed to him, were also married to other people, some of whom were sealed to him after his death. You figure that one out, you tell me. It's estimated that Brigham Young had 55 wives. So there's a lot of, a lot of these, not all of these marriages resulted in sexual unions or children, but the indication, of course, being that you wanted to be connected with this person. Why would women agree to be in plural marriages? It wasn't, you might think, your first answer might be, well, there might have been more women than men in early Mormonism. That would seem to make sense why you would have plural marriages. But it appears to be the case that the sexes were about equal in Mormon communities. So it wasn't an overabundance of women compared to men. So what would have been appealing? Well, religious doctrine, right? This is a religious teaching. And so that might have been appealing. But other things might have been appealing as well. It might have provided the opportunity for particularly poor women to marry successful, wealthy men. That this was an opportunity to move up in social status. The pressure from families to marry well-placed men, no matter how much older. Just the vocation of motherhood, right? That this would be a way that you could be a mother. All of these things might have made this appealing to women, but also there was pressure from the church, from your family, that would have fit into that as well. The United States government, of course, moved several times to try and suppress plural marriage. It was made illegal by Congress in 1862. In 1872, Brigham Young was arrested on an unlawful cohabitation charge, that he was unlawfully cohabitating with a woman who was not his official wife. It was later dropped. There was another law passed in 1874 to try and make anti-polygamy a stronger law. In 1882, another bill was passed. Raids were made by federal marshals into Utah territory to arrest polygamists. But the Mormons created an underground, so to speak, where they were helping people escape to Canada or to Mexico. In 1887, another law was passed. In 1890, almost 67 years to the day, that Smith was supposedly told about the Golden Plagues. The president of the Latter-day Saint Church, a man named Willard Woodruff, released a document called the Manifesto, which was a document that claimed to be a revelation that polygamy was no longer sanctioned by the church, that God had allowed it for a certain time but was now revoking that. In 1893, the President of the United States offered amnesty for anyone that was polygamous in polygamous union before November 1st, 1890. And then finally, 1896, Utah became a state. So a lot of people suggest that it was polygamy that was holding up Utah's statehood, even though it had met all the other conditions that are required for a territory to become a state. We don't have time, we won't have time to talk about how eventually there's a splinter group of Latter-day Saints that develops, fundamentalist Latter-day Saints that still practice polygamy, and so things like Sister Wives on TLC, and that's the fundamentalist Latter-day Saints. That's not representative of the main church, which says, if you practice polygamy, you're going to be excommunicated. Very, very brief overview of Mormonism. What questions do you have? None? Seriously? Let's move on then to another somewhat sizable group, the Jehovah's Witnesses. This group was started by a man named Charles Taze Russell. Russell was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1852 to a wealthy family, grew up Presbyterian, but with all that millennial expectation was going on, the Adventists, William Miller's kind of holdover, the interest in Revelation and other prophetic books eventually led Russell to leave Presbyterianism. He was really interested in the prophetic literature of the Bible. And so even as a teenager, he's studying Daniel and Revelation. And he starts engaging others with his studies and what he believes he's discovering. Eventually starting local study groups known as Bible studies. Now, this is not intended at the time to become a new denomination or anything. He's just meeting with other people studying the Bible. But eventually he starts writing books and developing other types of doctrines. And one of the most distinct beliefs at the time were his beliefs about the second coming of Christ. And so like William Miller, Russell develops a couple of things that are focused on the coming of Christ, and he goes so far as to, like Miller, date the second coming. Russell eventually offered several dates when this event would occur. In the early 1870s, he promulgated the belief that Jesus had spiritually returned to earth in 1874 and would complete this return in 1878 with the beginning of the morning. When Jesus did not return in 1878, he later predicted Jesus would return in 1914. Eventually, after his death, other dates were given as late as 1975. But after 1975 passed, the leaders of the Jehovah's Witnesses have not offered any subsequent dates as to when Jesus is to return. Also distinctive was his belief that the church, from the time of Jesus to the end time, the second coming, would consist of only 144,000 members, based off of Revelation chapter 7. And by 1881, he essentially made the claim that this number was nearly complete, but did allow for the possibility that living members of the 144,000 could fall away, which would allow other people to be added to this. This was a special honor to be part of the 144,000. And not many people, including ancient people like Moses and Elijah, weren't included in that. Now, in contrast to the 144,000, who were a very special class of members, there was the Great Company, also referred to in Revelation chapter 7. And so these people would live on a reconstituted earth, while the 144,000 would be with Jesus in heaven. Eventually, the group starts institutionalizing, mostly around the writing work that Russell is doing. Russell starts producing a journal called Zion's Watchtower and the Herald of Christ's Presence, which continues today simply as the Watchtower. It's one of the pieces of literature Jehovah's Witnesses will leave with you if they stop by your door. And within 8 years, Russell was publishing over 4 million copies of this magazine. He would eventually incorporate his publishing into Zion's Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. Zion would later be dropped. This is the only official organization of Jehovah's Witnesses. There's not another organization or headquarters. The society was started in Pennsylvania, but Russell moved it to Brooklyn in 1900, where it stays today. It was the group that was responsible for publishing all sorts of things related to Jehovah's Witnesses. The death of Russell served as a key turning point, however. And his death led to a leadership crisis. Many of those Bible students defected. And there was a struggle for power, and eventually a man named Joseph Rutherford, who was a Missouri lawyer, was elected as president of the Publishing Society. And it's Judge Rutherford who would then take this group, name them in the 1930s Jehovah's Witnesses, and develop some of the other distinctive doctrines. We'll probably have some time to talk about that in the 20th century when we get to that point. Last thing here in the last minute or two, I want to talk a little bit about missions. Gonzalez focuses on a variety of European and American missions to places like India, Japan, China, focused mostly on Catholic and Protestants. But he doesn't talk about, I want to talk about here briefly, is the missionary work of Orthodox Christians. Russian missions started in North America in Alaska in the 18th and 19th centuries. And unlike European Catholic missions, which kind of gradually established dioceses, bishops, the Russians moved much faster. Alaska's first resident bishop was ordained in 1840. The Russians also had a different mentality. Alaska was Russia. It's not New Russia, like New Spain, New France. Russians had a variety of physical appearances, so there wasn't that distinction like there was between Europeans and Native Americans. Right? And so because Russia was more diverse, there wasn't that racism. They were also more open to blending native traditions and Orthodox traditions, unlike Presbyterians, who were another major missionary group to Alaska, who wanted to maintain separate. Eventually, Russian missions moved down the west coast, setting up in San Francisco, and it becomes one of the most thriving Indian missions north of Mexico. Alaska, of course, is sold to the United States in 1867. Still, throughout the 19th century, a very small number, but eventually immigration from Russia, from other Orthodox churches, Greek Orthodox, Bulgarian, Romanian, etc., would grow the Orthodox population in the United States substantially into the 20th century. We'll say more about Orthodox Christianity, specifically Russian Orthodox Christianity, in the 20th century. And we'll pick that up on Thursday.